I think I'm miscalculated of suggesting that I will talk in 30 minutes about intelligible matter and the world soul and nature. So I will skip the world soul. I'm sure she will not be offended by that, because I will talk about her daughter, nature, toward the end. But I want to mention one interesting aspect of intelligible matter, which was in some ways what we heard earlier will be very interesting, I think, in the context of what Plotinus might be saying when he talks about intelligible matter. First thing I want to talk about can be associated with the mother in this archetypal sense, and this is indefinite diet or intelligible matter, because for Plotinus those two are the same thing. Namely, it is the first thing that is created by the good or the one. The first product of the one is intelligible matter, noetica hyla, or the indefinite diet. In his definition of matter, Plotinus says this is some sort of substrate, hypokeimenon, and receptacle, hypotoche, of forms. And he's clearly combining Plato and Aristotle, because the term hypotoche, receptacle, comes from Plato's Timaeus, 49a, while hypokeimenon is a technical term in Aristotle, for instance, in his Physics, book 192a. And Plotinus describes this first creature of the one as pure movement, pure difference, pure potentiality, which is very interesting, because clearly he associates those things with both the feminine and with the potentially negative or even potentially evil, but still it also has enormous power to create. So there is a certain ambiguity in his description of intelligible matter. While matter in Aristotle especially is absolutely passive, it is not exactly the same in Plotinus. So he says that in 6.9, he says that life in that intelligible realm of intellect or nous is the active actuality of intellect, and the active actuality generates gods in quiet contact with that good. So here we have an image of generation, of giving birth or generating the gods. Let's leave aside the question, who are the gods? Are they the forms, the ideas, or they are different creatures? Certainly they exist within the realm of intellect, and they are being generated or born by some kind of contact with the good or the one. And in fact, Plotinus is describing intellect, nous, as a paternal figure very often, and sometimes he even identifies him with Kronos from Greek mythology. And by identifying him with Kronos, he gives him at least a potentially feminine side, because Kronos swallowed his children. So it was like a reversal of giving birth, like pregnancy in reverse, because the children which came out of Rhea were swallowed back by Kronos. He has them in his belly, and only one escaped, namely Zeus, who in some places stands for the world. So, and here I want to, at the beginning, do something very audacious. I want to disagree a bit with Professor Edwards. Maybe it's a bias because of my maternal tongue, which is Polish, and we have basically the same structure as Latin and Greek in terms of that every noun is either masculine, feminine, or neuter. I think it matters if even an abstract noun is masculine or feminine. I think it has some, I don't know of any psychological studies on that, but I think we also have the word in Polish is neuter, like verbum in Latin, and I think it has some unconscious impact on the way the word is imagined as the second person. But that's a matter for debate. But I want to claim here that for Plotinus, actually, it matters the fact that intellect, nous, ho nous, it's masculine, while matter, hülle, is feminine, just like soul, psyche. I want to read to you a passage of a very beautiful, famous passage from Treatise 6-7, chapter 35. Plotinus describes this generation of the gods in intellect in a very interesting way. He says, intellect also then has one power for thinking, by which it looks at the things in itself or in himself, and one by which he looks at what transcends him, by touching and reception. Those are important terms here, by which also before he, intellect, saw only, and by seeing acquired intellect and is one. And that first one is the contemplation of intellect in his right mind, het thea nou emphronos. And the other is intellect in love, nous eron, when he goes out of his mind, drunk with the nectar, this is a quotation, then he falls in love, simplified into happiness by having his fill, haplotheis eis eupatreian tokoro. And it is better for it to be drunk with a drunkenness like this than to be more respectably sober. But does that intellect see in part at one time some things, and another and others? No, but our rational discourse instructing us makes them come to be. But intellect always has his thinking and always has his not thinking, but looking at that God, the one, in another way. For when he saw him, he had offspring and was intimately aware of their generation and existence within him. And when he sees these, he is said to think, but he sees that by the power by which later he was going to think. So here we have an image of not only the generation of the intelligible world of the forms or the ideas, but we have an image of marital love, marital intercourse between the one or the good on the one hand and intellect on the other. But intellect is chronos, he's masculine. So how this is possible? Because intellect has two levels, and the first primal level of intellect is precisely intelligible matter. So this is this feminine aspect of intellect, which only later becomes this fully fledged nous, fully fledged intelligible world, which Plotinus conceives as more masculine than feminine. And Plotinus quotes here, when he says that intellect is drunk with the nectar, he quotes Plato. More specifically, he quotes a myth which we find in Plato's Symposium, 203 A to C. This is the myth of the birth of Eros. And there's just one phrase from Symposium. But the whole myth is about the parents of Eros, who are Poros and Penia, so resource or plenty or wealth on the one hand and poverty on the other. So when Aphrodite was born, there was a great wedding held in the garden of Zeus, her father, and so poverty came begging, and there was also Poros, wealth or resource, son of cunning, who became drunk. There was no wine at this point of history, but fortunately there was the nectar, which seems to be very good stuff, because Poros went not only drunk, but completely unconscious, asleep. And while he was asleep, and here's some trigger warnings are due, I think, because Penia, well, to put it mildly, took advantage of the fact and conceived a son with the sleeping unconscious Poros, and this son is Eros, or love. So Plotinus uses this image of being drunk with the nectar from this myth. And Hilary Armstrong, the famous Plotinian scholar, he complained about Plotinus's use of allegory and myth. He complained that Plotinus is not consistent, that he's not doing allegorical interpretation properly like he should, like Philo or Origen. So basically Armstrong influenced very strongly the Plotinian scholarship, and Plotinian scholars think that it's not worthwhile to really take seriously Plotinus's use of myths. I, again, audaciously perhaps, but I tend to disagree with that. I think Plotinus, when he uses this phrase from the myth of Poros and Penia, he really wants us to think about the myth, because he speaks about this marital intercourse here between the good and intelligible matter. Intelligible matter is Penia, poverty, the feminine principle, and the good is the masculine principle, or Poros, and it's entirely consistent with the way Plotinus speaks about the good. The good is the abundance, the ultimate infinity of all reality, which pours over and out, while intelligible matter is poor in the sense of being this receptacle. So the key aspect here is that intelligible matter receives something from the good, and the good gives something as if outside of himself, plants this in intelligible matter, and out of this loving encounter, intellect, fully fledged intellect or being, the world of the forms is born. So the whole reality is born out of love, out of this marital, mythological contact or encounter. So the higher nous, higher intellect, is what can touch the good and what can receive, which is obviously a sexual image here. So in terms of what Andrea was saying earlier, it is no question that within Plotinian metaphysics, and I think it's also true in the later metaphysics, God, the highest God, has to be thought of as masculine if we use those categories at all, while reality created by him has to be thought in terms of the feminine, precisely because the feminine is what receives and the masculine is what gives by going out of himself. So this very physical, physiological, sexual, archetypal image permeates the whole metaphysical framework of Plotinus. This is Paul Rubens' image painting the Garden of Love, referring to the myth of Poros and Penia that I was talking about. And the same dynamics that we have seen here, so the masculine principle pouring out, and the feminine principle, material, potential principle, receiving this and giving birth to a child, it can be found also on lower levels of reality in Plotinus. I will not talk about it for long, about the world soul and the birth of soul, but we find exactly the same dynamics here. So first we have something I would call psychic matter, which is indefinite and potential. It receives something from intellect. Here intellect is masculine, soul is feminine, and the logos is born. Plotinus also speaks of Eros as the child of soul, but he also speaks about the logos being poros in this Platonic myth. So the same pattern is repeated. You have this in your handout, which you don't have, but we can go back to it if you're interested, how this is repeated on various levels of reality, this interplay between the masculine and the feminine elements. Okay, and then so it's all a bit complicated. I call it divine family because there is a sexual ambiguity that Professor Edwards was talking about earlier. So, for instance, intellect is at the same time feminine in his receiving capacity, but he is masculine because he is able to impregnate the lower level of reality. So the good is all the good has nothing feminine in it, but intellect and soul have both the masculine and the feminine aspect. The same with soul. The world soul is represented in Plotinus either as Zeus or as Aphrodite. So there is the masculine and the feminine side to soul, just as to intellect. And there is also every time a child or a son born, and Plotinus even recurs to some wordplay. As you remember, he spoke about intellect being filled, which is in Greek choros, but the word choros also means a boy or a son. So what intelligible matter is filled with is what Plotinus calls choros, and he says it's a beautiful son, a beautiful boy born of the good and intelligible matter. And he even says that choros and chronos are basically etymologically connected, which they are not, as far as I know. So yeah, so this is a bit complicated divine family, but now to something more interesting, namely temptress. So this is the more dark or even evil side of the feminine. And here I want to start with what Jean-Marc Narbonne, a great Plotinian scholar, also interested in Gnosticism. He suggested in his book Plotinus in Dialogue with the Gnostics that, well, he's not the only one who suggested it. Plotinus, as Professor Edwards was already saying before, he was refuting the Gnostics, probably the so-called Platonizing Sethian Gnostics, but Alexander Mazur suggested that Plotinus probably became very familiar with Gnosticism when he was in Egypt. He was born in Egypt, he was educated in Egypt, so he might have been very well connected with some Gnostic groups. But later, when he came to Rome, we see Plotinus as someone who criticizes the Gnostics very strongly. But I think both Narbonne and Mazur and others and Turner are right saying that there is still a lot of this Gnostic element in Plotinus. Even if he tries to reject it consciously, his mysticism and his use of mythology seems pretty close to Gnosticism. We heard about Barbelo already. So in Sethian Gnosticism, what Plotinus calls intellect would be Barbelo, this feminine eon, and probably intelligible matter, this female receiving principle in Plotinus, is connected not only to Plato and Aristotle, but also to the Gnostics and this mythological feminine Barbelo, who, by the way, in Sethian Gnosticism consists of three elements which are masculine: Calyptos, Autogenes, and the third one I don't remember. So there is a sexual ambiguity, of course, to her as well. So why is intelligible matter temptress? So first of all, what Narbonne pointed out is that Plotinus rejects the Gnostic idea that soul, identified with them by some of them at least, with Sophia, falls. So at least some Gnostics claim that evil originates in the spiritual realm. So one of the eons falls, for instance, Sophia, and this leads to the creation of the world. So evil is born in heaven, so to speak. Plotinus rejects that. So he wants to claim that soul, especially the world soul, cannot fall, intellect cannot fall. Those divine principles are absolutely safe. They are not inclined to fall. Although in certain places there are some suggestions in Plotinus that there is at least a danger of their fall. We fall as individual souls. We fall into evil, we sink into the sensible realm, but the world soul doesn't. So Plotinus has to come up with some other origin of evil than soul. And that is why in his late treatise, but not only in his late treatise, but in his late treatise on matter, this is 1.8, he suggests that matter is responsible for evil. Narbonne claims Plotinus does it to say to the Gnostics, no, soul is not the source of evil. Soul doesn't fall because she makes some error, mistake, or she sins. There is some external source of evil which tempts individual souls into fall, but not the world soul. So who is this temptress? And Narbonne points out something very interesting, I think, namely a very weird language that Plotinus uses when he speaks on matter in treatise 2.5 and treatise 3.6. So in 2.5, Plotinus says, if then it, or she, matter, has made good its escape, pephoge, she escaped from the nature of the true realities and cannot attain even to those which are falsely said to exist, because it is not even a phantasm of rational form, as these are, in what sort of existence can it be grasped? So matter escapes from the real being, from the realm of intellect, the realm of the forms. And in the next chapter, Plotinus says, matter is as if cast out, ekrypheisa, and utterly separated, pante chorischeisa, and unable to change itself, but always in the state it was from the beginning, and it was non-existent. She seems very much existent here, of course, even though she is non-existent. It was not anything actually from the beginning, since it stood apart. And here's the word apostasis used. So it's a very strange language. Matter, which seems to be totally passive, and even this divine principle receiving the influx from the good, suddenly escapes, is cast out, separated by whom? Or she stands apart from reality. And a similar thing Plotinus says in the second part of treatise 3.6. He says it is not soul or intellect or life or logos or limit matter, for it is unlimitedness or power. She's not power, for what does she make? But falling outside of these, it could not properly receive the title of being. Again, the idea of the fall, falling outside. And a couple of verses later, an interesting thing I will return in a minute to, whatever announcement she makes, therefore, is a lie. And in chapter 13 of the same treatise, he says, since the nature of which we are speaking must not be any real being, but must have escaped, again, altogether from the reality of real beings, that which is utterly forbidden, she is that which is utterly forbidden to have any part in truth, because she is falsehood. So very interesting mythological language, personifying language, which Plotinus doesn't use very often, but I think he uses it in a quite significant way. And decades ago, Hilary Armstrong wrote a short paper on how St. Augustine uses Plotinus's intelligible matter in his interpretation of the book of Genesis and the first day or one day when light is generated and light is divided from darkness. So Armstrong showed that Augustine is heavily dependent on Plotinus. Augustine, in the 12th book of the Confessions, in the Genesia Litteram, in the commentary on the book of Genesis, Augustine describes the creation of angels as first creation of indefinite potential matter, both intelligible and corporeal. But for now, I'm not talking about corporeal matter. There is some spiritual matter for Plotinus, which then converts to God. It turns to God and becomes the angels, but not all angels become angels. Some portion of this intelligible matter becomes the fallen angels for Augustine. So Augustine is claiming that when God says, let there be light, it's about creation of the angels. At least that's his hypothesis. And then when God separates the light from the darkness, it's about the fall of the evil angels who don't want to receive the form from God, but fall into formlessness, while the good holy angels, they are formed by God. And here is a quotation from the 13th book of the Confessions, when Augustine says, that matter, physical or spiritual, is created by God, and it has no existence. He repeats Plotinus here, no being, no existence. And Augustine says, what claim upon you had the inchoate spiritual creation, even to be merely in a dark, fluid state like the ocean abyss? It would have been dissimilar to you unless by your word it had been converted to the same word by whom it was made, so that illuminated by him it became light, the good angels, and though not in an equal measure, became conformed to a form equal to you. Just as in the case of a physical body, to be is not the same as to be beautiful, since otherwise it would be impossible for it to be ugly, so also for a created spirit to live is not the same as to live wisely. Otherwise, it would be immutably wise. But it is good for it always to cleave to you, lest by turning away from you and by slipping back into a life like the dark abyss, it lose the light it obtained by turning to you. Armstrong doesn't write about it, but I think that Augustine is using here not only the dynamics of the influx from the good and the turning back, but he uses even Plotinus's strange language about intelligible matter being cast out or escaping, not wanting to be formed by the good, and thus constituting the principle of evil. So Augustine is using this imagery of this feminine, inchoate potential matter escaping from the realm of form to speak of the fallen angels, because in Plotinus there are no fallen angels, apart from this rather vague, possibly Gnostic, possibly mythological way he speaks about matter as the source of evil, the temptress that causes the souls to fall. And this Augustinian idea, not the Plotinian idea, but the Augustinian idea was received later in an interesting way. And here will be a short musical intermezzo before I conclude my paper. Joseph Haydn, he spent some time in England, and inspired by Handel, he composed an oratorio, The Creation, Die Schöpfung. Libretto, both in German and in English, was written by Gottfried van Swieten. And at the beginning of this beautiful oratorio, there is an aria with a chorus. The aria is sang by the angel Uriel, and this is clearly this particular theme, probably based on the City of God. That's my by Augustine. That's my guess, or other sources, maybe Kabbalistic and esoteric stuff of the 18th century. So Uriel sings, now vanish before the holy beams the gloomy dismal shades of darkness. This is the first day. The first of days appears. Disorder yields and order fair prevails. Affrighted fly hell's spirits black in throngs. So this is intelligible matter cast out or escaping. Down they sink in the deepest abyss to endless night. And here we hear the deepest abyss sinking as a chorus, and you will hear in a moment that definitely the masculine character of the chorus, this not the feminine, despairing, cursing rage attends the rapid fall, and suddenly the atmosphere changes, and this aria with chorus ends on a positive note, where a chorus sings, a new created world springs up at God's command. So this is a separation from darkness, from light. And now just I wanted to play for you this short piece. Neue Welt, this new world that has been created by dispelling the dark side of the feminine and creating order. In Plotinus, it's created by a female figure, Nature, who is the daughter of the world. So here you can see William Blake's one of his plates for his poem Europe, a Prophecy. whereas probably an allusion to Milton or some other source. And when we talk about nature in Plotinus, it's obviously the treatise on contemplation 3.8, where he gives voice to nature. So there is a prosopopoeia, a rhetorical figure by making some inanimate or not human figure speaking, and Plotinus does it on several occasions in the Enneads. So here, nature speaks in chapter 4 of this treatise, and she says, "You ought not to ask, but to understand in silence. You too, just as I am silent and not in the habit of talking. Understand what then? That what comes into being is what I see in my silence, an object of contemplation which comes to be naturally, and that I, originating from this sort of contemplation, have a contemplative nature. And my act of contemplation makes what it contemplates, as the geometers draw the figures while they contemplate. But I do not draw, but as I contemplate, the lines which bound bodies come to be as if they fell from my contemplation." So nature is who creates the physical, the sensible world. The world soul doesn't do it on her own. The world soul does it by the mediation of her daughter, and nature says she is the daughter of another goddess of the world soul. Here is a medieval picture from a codex of Romain de la Rose from the end of the 15th century, nature forging a baby. A somewhat disconcerting image, but Plotinus's nature is not like that, I can assure you. So she is a very benign figure, but in this speech we can already see a very interesting element, namely she is somewhat stern. So she says, well, I don't want to talk really, I'm a silent person, but if you insist, I will tell you who I am. And she's clearly a teacher, a spiritual guide, a spiritual master in this rhetorical image, as just as well as she is the creator or creatrix. Nature fulfills some of the functions that the creator, Demiurgos, in Timaeus. So in Timaeus 53b, God, who is called the father of all by Plato, he imposes shapes and numbers on the receptacle, on matter, on the feminine, maternal principle. And she also escapes in Plato, by the way. There is in Plato mention of matter trying to escape from this patriarchal imposition of order, shapes and numbers. But nature does the same thing, effortlessly, spontaneously, naturally. Plutarch famously said in his Quaestiones Conviviales, God always geometrizes. Here, God is nature, the goddess. And this comes from the Republic, most probably, where Plato says the geometers make use of the visible forms and talk about them, though they are not thinking of them, but of those things of which they are a likeness. So Plato says in the Republic, geometers, mathematicians, they draw figures in the sand, but those are only images because they are not thinking about spatially extended physical figures. They're thinking about the mathematical figures which are accessible only to our dianoia, to our reason. So here nature is described by Plotinus as a scientist, as a geometer. So it's a curious image of this female mathematician or geometer creating the world. Some time ago, there was a conference about ancient female philosophers, 3 of them, Diotima, Aspasia, partner of Pericles, and Hypatia. So unfortunately, Diotima was a philosopher but never existed. Aspasia existed but wasn't a philosopher. And Hypatia of Alexandria, of course, she both existed and was a philosopher. But Plotinus was not mentioned in that particular conference. But in Plotinus, we find this figure of a female scientist, philosopher, spiritual teacher, in fact, because she is the teacher here. So curiously, many scholars think that Plotinus's nature is a sleepy nature, because she herself says, if anyone wants to, Plotinus says about nature, if anyone wants to attribute to it, to nature, understanding or perception, it will not be the understanding or perception we speak of in other beings. It will be like comparing the consciousness of someone fast asleep to the consciousness of someone awake. So a lot of Plotinian scholars, especially earlier, claimed that nature has this kind of sleepy, dreamy consciousness. It's not really fully awake. But I don't think it's a correct interpretation at all, because in the treatise against the Gnostics, Plotinus accuses Gnostics precisely of that, and he says, shall our wisdom be greater than that of the gods? So I think that, and he also says that nature's contemplation is a vision of splendor and delight. It's not a sleepy, dreamy consciousness. In this passage, when he says that nature is not fully awake in comparison to other beings, he clearly means higher beings, like the world soul, like intellect, or like the good. The good, Plotinus says, it's egregorsis, it's wakefulness. So we are not more awake than nature. She's far more awake than us. We are sleepy and dreamy in comparison to her. She is only in comparison to higher beings. So nature is contemplative, silent, very much awake, creating the physical, the sensible world without any effort, without any labor. And I will conclude with a beautiful passage from Wordsworth lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, where this image of this contemplative nature, I'm not sure if Wordsworth could be familiar with 3:8 by Plotinus, but he says that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and becoming a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk and for the music as well. Just a quick remark about the music, and then, it was very happy. And speaking about terrible things, there was a great contrast between the subject and the global optimistic, interpretation. So yeah. And about your talk, so why did you consider that the feminine was passive and receptive and the masculine was active and giving? You took as an example sexual intercourse, right? Saying that the man gives and the woman receives. But that is not exactly right, is it? I mean, can we really say this? Even biologically speaking, it is not completely true. So, on what grounds do you think that the tradition of considering the feminine as receptive and passive and the masculine as active is based upon? What do you think? In Plotinus, for instance.
Well, of course, we are not talking biology in general, or we are not talking sexual life in general, but we are talking about ancient sources, and of course Plotinus was working within a framework of Aristotle's biology, where the conception of a human being is coming together of form, which comes from the male, and matter, which comes from the female. So this is I mean, even in the Middle Ages, it was, of course, accepted entirely. But curiously, Plotinus, who is, I mean, this is his point of departure, obviously. His intelligible matter is not like that. So intelligible matter is not just a space into which the good places, in which the good places his semen, but intelligible matter which receives something from the good immediately becomes very active. And Plotinus says, he calls her the dynamis, power of all, which is usually reserved for the good. So intelligible. So I would say in the order of created things, I know that many scholars would claim that Plotinus was not speaking of creation but emanation. I reject that distinction. So I'm using creation. So in the order of created reality, intelligible matter is the highest being. She is the highest and the most powerful in a way, which is, I think it comes from Gnosticism, because certainly not from Aristotle.
Yes.
Matthew had a question.
Yes. There was so much that I loved about your paper, from examining Plotinus, the nature of Plotinus, to the images, to the music, to the poetry. Thank you. I have a concern, however, and I think that we have enough common interest for you to have sympathy for my concern. Although my concern goes very much in the direction of issues that were raised by Professor Edwards, whose paper said things that have been bothering me for some of the morning. It has to do, I'll try not to be long, but sorry, I've been quiet all day, so it has to do with language, with certain lexical indexing, I suppose one could say, and the relationship of metaphysics and the achievement that is classical metaphysics to that. So when you talk about words being in different languages, masculine or feminine or neuter, and everyone in the room knows at least one living or dead language that does this. Words in these languages have etymologies that are often strange and that depend on many factors. And I'm very uncomfortable saying that, you know, this table that is masculine, feminine, or neuter in any language has any conceptual link to anything that belongs to the masculine, the feminine, or the neuter. Now, if we bring this to another level and we relate the conceptual to the mythological, which deals with images that are very concrete, I suppose I'm thinking along the lines of the allegorical, or even as Schelling would say in the 19th century, the tautogorical. No matter how one wants to negotiate that relationship, one has to negotiate a certain relationship between the mythos and the metaphysical. And I think that this has not been so much addressed today, and there is a real danger here, because the achievement of classical metaphysics, from Xenophon all the way up to Anselm and even further, is to Aquinas, I suppose we could say, has a certain effect of giving conceptual life to what was previously symbolic. And there was a fight, if you look at someone like Xenophon, to take the strange beliefs of the pagan world and to say, no. The poets are very good poets, but they're not always very good philosophers. And so I'm very concerned about too much talk of the masculine and feminine when it comes to the metaphysical, because this seems to be sort of anti-fides quaerens intellectuum, a sort of opposite movement where we say, well, now we have a metaphysical structure. Nous is a great example. And if we aren't careful about the way we relate it to some of the mythological language it might have been related to in its previous apparitions, we could be doing an enormous disservice to philosophical and theological thought by bringing in the chaotic and sometimes arbitrary meanings of old pagan myths. So I want to defend the achievement that is metaphysics and conceptual thinking in a sort of Xenophon brain. And I would add that Pierre Hadot, who was much more agnostic than some of us would like to admit, once said that one of the goals of philosophy is to sort of curb the enthusiasm of certain kinds of religious thinking. So I'm sure you have some sympathy to metaphysical thinking. So you see what my concern is. I don't want to push on you too hard, but you see why I'm kind of worried.
Yes, yes, I do.
Can I say something?
You want to go first?
Yes, I do.
Well, the question was,
I would like to hear the answer
okay,
first.
okay,
Sure.
yeah, that's, I love that you bring this point, but it's a subject for such a long and interesting conversation. Yeah, the phrase that comes to mind is from C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, where one of the protagonists, called the fox, always exclaims, "The lies of the poets, the lies of the poets." Of course, there is. It's one way of looking at it, but I don't think it's a very fruitful way to look at metaphysics as opposed to the mythological, the metaphorical, the symbolic. Because Plotinus says in 586 that the Egyptian hieroglyphs were closer to intellect than propositions and concepts, because they were, images condensing non-discursiveness of expressing the non-discursiveness of intellect. So there is this tradition, and I think it gets stronger later in Christian and Abrahamic religions, Platonism, where images are not seen always as inferior to concepts in metaphysics, but maybe as equal, or maybe sometimes higher than concepts. So Dionysius the Areopagite, for instance, he says obviously that God is not a lion, God is not fire, God is not tree or whatever, or rock. But also he is all those things, because all those things express something of him. And we have to live in that tension between the mythical and the metaphorical, which expresses God in one way, and the purely conceptual and propositional, which expresses God in another way. So I would rather look for a synthesis of those two approaches. And I wouldn't, because I don't think we can translate myths into concepts. I would agree with people like Tolkien or Barfield, or Lewis himself, who would say that we cannot do it. The symbolic images of the feminine and the masculine, then they contain something more. We can intuit it, but we cannot express it in conceptual propositional language. So, and I'm afraid that God has this very disquieting habit of revealing himself through myth and not through philosophy only. So I think the Western metaphysics had to grapple with this, and in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and later, with the fact that one truth expressed himself or herself both in the mythological, pictorial, symbolic language and in the language of philosophy. And the question is whether this is irreconcilable or reconcilable. Or that's a very interesting conversation, I think.
I'm happy with that.
Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to say first the same thing as Liz, so thank you.
Okay.
You answered wonderfully. I just wanted to add that, well, that's a classical positivist attack towards symbolical thought and towards mythos, because, of course, for positivism, you have progress, you have a thought about progress, and first you have mythos, then you have metaphysics, and then you have what? Science, which is superior to metaphysics, and that you did not mention, of course. And so you have this positivist attack, and also postmodern. So it's very classical, very classical. And what can we answer this about saying that, well, myths are confusing and metaphysics has to be a higher form of knowledge and of logos, actually, and keep things straight, actually, and yes. So I would like to read you a passage from Iamblichus de Mysteris about symbols. So I quote, Iamblichus was talking about the Egyptians, And of course, he had in the highest esteem the Egyptians, as opposed to the Greeks, because for Iamblichus, the Greeks used to talk, but without a purpose. Iamblichus said that, well, the Greeks just used concepts, but without the depth of symbols. So, I'm reading, so what he's saying about the Egyptians and about tradition. For them, imitating the nature of the universe and the demiurgic power of the gods displays certain signs of mystical, arcane, and invisible intellections by means of symbols. Just as nature copies the unseen principles in visible forms through some mode of symbolism, and the creative activity of the gods indicates the truth of the forms in visible signs. Perceiving, therefore, that all superior beings rejoice in the efforts of their inferiors to imitate them, and therefore wish to fill them with good things, insofar as it is possible through imitation, it is reasonable that they should prefer a mode of concealment that is appropriate to the mystical doctrine of concealment in symbols. So, according to Iamblichus, concepts and symbols, of course, are the same thing, but expressed in different languages. And the strength of the symbol is not that it is confusing, it is that it is ambivalent, and that ambivalence is its strength, it's not its weakness. When you say a concept is clearer because it goes only one way, it means it's simplistic, really. It means it's not very much developed. If it's a one-way signification in a discourse, it means, well, it could be made by a machine, really. It doesn't have to be made by a human mind. If it's just one way, it's like coding. When you do informatics, cybernetics, is something one way, saying, well, this thing is white, it cannot be black at the same time. But also Asian metaphysics teaches us that this classical opposition isn't right, actually, because I was thinking of Nagarjuna. I don't know if you heard of him. He's an Indian metaphysicist who spoke about the tetralemma. And the tetralemma for Nagarjuna is something I said, well, it is, it isn't, it is, and isn't at the same time. Neither it is and neither it isn't. So reality actually is much more complicated than a one-way logos, as you said, which would be a progress from a chaotic, original, and frightening myth world of religious confusion, actually. But no, that confusion is something we have to face, because it's not confusion, it's depth, you know. It's the depth of the soul and of reality, which was much more exciting and complicated than what you call classical metaphysics, which is actually Aristotelian metaphysics. So yeah, that was what I wanted to answer, because
now I feel like defending him.
No.
Yeah, because when we say,
by the way, you went very, very quickly from metaphysics to positivism, and I think that a lot of people in this room would like to stand up and defend Aristotle right now, but please.
No, it's just I think the Gnostic mythology, which is very complex and confusing, shows us that, of course, there can be something wrong in too much conceptual thinking, but there can be something wrong in too much myth without any structure. So what I was trying to say is that the marriage of both would be the most fertile.
That's why I was satisfied with the answer, and why I didn't want to contradict, but rather push. I think that if Aristotle or a real good Aristotelian were here, that person would have something to say about, well, you know, there is a role for the conceptual and there's also a role for the symbolic. Noesis is not a kind of coding. And Bertrand Russell probably had no use for it, you know, self-thinking thought.
But that, you know, that's usually an attack addressed to the feminine being chaotic, as opposed to the masculine being akin to order, and very well organized. You know, that's interesting. You know, because you have this opposition between chaos and cosmos in what you are saying. So chaos would be religion, and cosmos would be classical metaphysics in what you are saying.
I mean, in all Greek thought, including Christian thought, you'll find in certain situations that an author takes a stance against mythos in favour of logos. It's probably already there in Plato's Protagoras, for example, certainly the Republic, and yet, of course, Plato himself uses mythos on other occasions. And yeah, I think Neoplatonists often waver between a quite reductive attitude to mythology, where they will just try to interpret it in lucid philosophical parlance, and then sometimes they will accept that they've got to leave it alone, and occasionally a Neoplatonist will even stray into a bit of myth-making himself in the way that Plotinus does when he personifies nature. But certainly in some moods, when they're attacking someone who's more mythologically minded than they will often sound, as you would say, very positivistic.
Thank you.
And I was just thinking about Augustine's Confessions 7, book 7, when he says something which is a very strange thing to say, namely that Plotinus's Enneads and the prologue to the Gospel of John says exactly the same things, think just in a different way. So one is with, he says, with sophisticated arguments, and the Gospel of John is another way of saying the same thing, which of course he knew it wasn't the same thing, but he still insisted that the gospel and Plotinus, of course excluding incarnation, is basically the same. But so the Gospel of John is maybe, of course, Augustine wouldn't call it a mythos, but certainly it wasn't a philosophical argument.
Well, thank you. Shall we?
Just an question. So about having masculine as passive and active. You began with the story of Penia and Phoros, but in that sexual intercourse, Penia is active and Phoros is active. It is like leap and drunk.
Yes. Thank you.
And in the story of Lot being raped by his daughters, which Origin compares with that in Chapter 4.